previous lecture focused on fiscal policy from a countercyclical perspective. That is, how can fiscal policy act over the business cycle to shorten recessions or discourage inflation? To put it a little bit differently, the previous lecture was about how fiscal policy could affect the two goals of inflation and unemployment. This lecture takes an alternative view of fiscal policy. It focuses on the long run and how government decisions about borrowing by running a budget deficit or saving by running a budget surplus would affect overall national savings. And by affecting national savings, how these government decisions about borrowing or saving can affect investment, which is one of the primary determinants of economic growth, or can affect the balance of trade. Let's remember that government borrowing is a part of national saving, as illustrated by this national saving and investment identity I keep referring to. Remember, this was first introduced back in Lecture 23. The basic idea is that the quantity of investment funds demanded in an economy has to be equal to the quantity of investment funds supplied in an economy. So, in the U.S. economy, the big sources of supply of investment funds are private saving and the inflow of foreign capital from abroad that results from the trade deficit. And the big sources of demand for investment funds are investment spending by private firms and the government demanding investment firms to cover its budget deficit. So when we think about this trade-off, we can see that since this has to hold true, no matter what, this identity has to hold true, it must be true that if the budget deficit goes up, one of three things must happen. Or to put it a little bit differently, if the budget deficit goes up, the money must come from one of three places. If the budget deficit goes up, the U.S. economy is borrowing more money. Where does that extra money come from? Well, there's really only three possibilities, and they're laid out in the National Savings and Investment Identity. One possibility is that private savings goes up. So government borrowing goes up, but there's an offsetting increase in private saving. And that offsetting increase in private saving provides the funds for the government borrowing. A second possibility is government borrowing goes up and it sucks the money away from private investment. And so private investment falls. And a third possibility is government borrowing goes up and there's an increased inflow of foreign capital from abroad. That is a bigger trade deficit. Now, what that National Savings and Investment Identity tells you is some combination of these three must happen. If the budget deficit goes up, there has to be either more private saving or less private investment or more money coming in from abroad. It has to balance out. The money has to come from someplace. But what you don't know is which one of the three it might be, or whether it might be some combination of all three. So, let's take these explanations in turn and look at each one at a time. Let's first think about how likely is it that an increased budget deficit would lead to an increase in private saving, which would help provide the funds for that budget deficit. Well, there's an economic theory to cover just about everything, and the key theory here is called Ricardian equivalence. The word Ricardian is because an early form of this theory dates back to some insights from a famous economist of the early 19th century named David Ricardo. That's why we call it Ricardian equivalence now. Ricardian equivalence is the theory that a rise in government borrowing will cause an offsetting rise in private saving. So as the government borrows more, private saving goes up by enough to provide the additional funds. The idea behind this theory is that imagine you're living in a country where the government starts borrowing a lot of money. Well, you have to think to yourself, oh boy, government's borrowing a lot of money. That probably means a tax increase is coming down the road, or maybe some other kind of financial unpleasantness. So I'd better jack up my savings now to get ready for what's coming down the road. And if you react in that way, then the increase in government borrowing could be causing an increase in private saving. So that's the theory. What's the actual evidence? Well, there are a number of studies by the World Bank which tend to show that there are places and times where this pattern does seem to hold to some extent. And a pattern across the world, a rough statement might be, that about half of increases in government borrowing are offset by more private saving. So in that sense, the theory of Ricardian equivalence does have some truth for a lot of countries. But the World Bank studies also show that in the United States, this particular theory doesn't hold very well. In the United States, it doesn't seem to be true that higher budget deficits are offset by more private saving. And if you think about patterns in recent years, this becomes pretty clear. We've had some very high budget deficits in the mid-2000s, but there hasn't been an offsetting rise in private saving in the mid-2000s. If you go back to the mid-1980s, when there were some very high budget deficits, there was no offsetting rise in private savings at that time. Now, it's true that in the 1990s, private saving dropped as budget deficits declined. But this is mainly because private saving has been dropping most of the time since the 1980s. They sometimes say, even a stopped clock is right twice a day, and every theory will be correct once in a while, but the fact that it's correct at one point in time is not especially good. It has to hold in good times and in bad times as well. And it's just an empirical fact that in the U.S. economy, private saving has not been tracking the budget deficit in an offsetting way, rising and falling along with the budget deficit. If anything, private saving has been relatively low in the mid-2000s. And so the impact of higher government borrowing isn't showing up in the U.S. economy as higher saving. It has to show up in one of these other ways, involving investment or the trade imbalance. So let's think about the impact of federal borrowing on investment. And investment here, I really mean physical capital investment by firms. This is what we refer to, and there's a theory for everything, as the theory of crowding out. And the theory of crowding out holds that as the government borrows more and more money to run very large budget deficits, then that reduces the funds that are available to private firms for their private investment. So the increase in government borrowing should mean less private investment. And conversely, a drop in government borrowing should mean more funds available for private investment. So, do we actually observe that pattern in the U.S. economy? Well, over time, private investment in the U.S. economy, investment by firms in plant and equipment, tends to be about 14 to 17% of gross domestic product in different years. When the budget deficit turned into surpluses in the late 1990s, round about 1998, the investment rate in the U.S. economy was also rising. The investment rate in the U.S. economy went from 14% of GDP in 1993 to 17.2% of GDP by 2000. So it went sort of from the bottom of its range to the top of its range. As the government began to run budget surpluses, more money was available for private firms to invest, and the investment rate went up. Conversely, when budget surpluses went back into deficit in the mid-2000s, the private investment rate sunk as well. For example, the ratio of investment to GDP dropped to about 14.8% by 2003 as the budget deficit swelled. So we've seen there a situation where there's a clear offset between the two. As the government began to run bigger surpluses, there was more money available for private investment. As the government ran deficits, there was less money available for private investment, just like the theory of crowding out would suggest. Now, it's sometimes true, as we've talked about in previous lectures, that investment can run by animal spirits. Investment may go too far, too fast, and that probably happened to some extent in the boom years of the late 1990s. But on average, year in, year out, investment in physical capital, in new plant and equipment, is one of the essential elements of economic growth. And it's also one of the key ways that new technologies that have been developed enter the production process. They enter the production process because the new technologies are built into new plant and equipment. And so there's reason to believe that if we could keep the budget deficit somewhat lower, there would be more money available for firms to invest, and it would be easier for firms to take new technologies and bring them into the productive plant and equipment that's out there in the economy. And that would be helpful to long-term economic growth. So that's, I think, one consequence of the large budget deficits has been this crowding out of private investment. The other theory we could call crowding in. that large government borrowing can crowd in a trade deficit. And what I mean by crowding in is that when there's lots of government borrowing, it draws in additional foreign investment. And as we've talked about in the earlier lectures, additional foreign investment means, to economists, it means literally the same thing as having a large trade deficit. And remember the overall patterns here. When budget deficits were very large, both in the mid-1980s and the mid-2000s, the trade deficits were also very large at those times. The term sometimes used for the two is they were twin deficits. There were twin deficits, a budget deficit and a trade deficit getting large at the same time. And those were linked. The budget deficits were in effect causing the trade deficits. However, the budget surpluses in the late 1990s didn't lead to a trade surplus. So these twin deficits aren't always twins. Instead, what happened was the extra money from the budget surpluses of the late 1990s went into an investment boom during those years. So it didn't reduce the trade imbalance, it just made more money available for private investment. So the key point here, I guess, as with a lot of economic things, is that budget deficits and trade deficits are linked together, but they aren't joined at the neck in the sense that they always have to move step by step exactly together. Sometimes they move together, and sometimes some other factor, like investment or savings, will have an impact on whether they're connected as well. Now, in the long run, a long series of ever-growing trade deficits just isn't sustainable for any economy. At some point, foreign investors won't want to keep holding more and more and more of their assets in the form of U.S. financial investments. It's already true, as we talked about in the earlier lecture on the trade imbalance, that with the large current account deficits we have, the U.S. economy is paying hundreds of billions of dollars a year to foreign owners of U.S. assets. And given the large indebtedness of the U.S. economy to the rest of the world, this amount is going to climb over time. It's also true that large trade deficits have a risk of economic dislocation. At some point, when the rest of the world becomes unwilling to hold as much in U.S. assets, the economy is going to swing back toward more balanced trade. As we'll discuss in later lectures, there's a real chance of a sharp drop in the exchange rate value of the U.S. dollar. That could be very unsettling to firms that rely on imports from all around the world, which is, of course, many, many firms in these globalizing times. So, bottom line lesson of all of this. In the short run of a few years, there's not a huge reason to worry about budget deficits, especially if the economy seems to be operating below potential GDP. For example, when the budget deficit went from surplus in 2001 to deficit in 2002, the U.S. economy is just coming out of a recession. Using an expansionary fiscal policy to boost aggregate demand at that point is arguably a pretty good idea. That's what you ought to be doing in the short term. Now, you might want to quarrel with exactly how that expansionary fiscal policy was carried out. You might want to say, my political preference would have been a different kind of tax cut structured a different way, or I might have preferred spending increases rather than tax cuts. My point here isn't to argue the details of policy. My point is just to say that from an overall macroeconomic point of view, having short-run budget deficits when the economy is slow is not a bad thing. But what happens when the deficits appear to be sustained and large and ongoing over a long, long time? Well, how do we even think about that? How do we measure those kinds of deficits? A deficit is government borrowing that happens in a single year. The government debt is the accumulation of that borrowing over a number of years. And so the government debt is a good measure of the sustained impact of deficits over a long period of time. It accumulates the deficits. So let's shift the focus here a little bit from talking about annual budget deficits and talk about government debt instead. And again, budget deficit, what happens in a single year in terms of government borrowing. Government debt is the accumulation of that borrowing over a number of years. So say, for example, the government has a debt built up of $4 trillion over time. And then next year, there's a budget deficit of $300 billion. At the end of that year, the total debt would be the $4 trillion you started with plus the $300 billion, and you'd have $4.3 trillion in debt. Each year, the debt is added the deficit is added to the accumulated debt. And if you have budget surpluses, then you can pay off some of the debt and reduce the amount of outstanding debt. Now, as we've been doing throughout these lectures, I think it's useful to look at the overall debt picture by dividing the debt in any given year, the accumulated debt, by gross domestic product. This has the effect of sort of adjusting for inflation and for growth in the economy over time, and it gives you a sense of the total debt in proportion to the economy at that time. Well, if you do that, if you look at a diagram of debt to GDP over time, here's the picture that gradually emerges. In the course of the 20th century, there are 4 time periods when government borrowing grows very, very rapidly, in a way where the debt to GDP ratio expands quite dramatically. 2 of them are after wartime, after World War I and World War II. There's a lot of borrowed money during war. A third is the Great Depression. And then the final time is the mid-1980s and early 1990s. Now, in between those times, government borrowed, and there were often budget deficits, but borrowing was low enough that the annual borrowing was adding to the debt less than the growth rate of the economy. So if you think about the ratio of debt to GDP, if debt is growing slowly with small budget deficits and GDP is rising a little bit faster, the debt to GDP ratio would be declining. So when you look at the pattern over time, what you see is the debt to GDP ratio peaks at about 100% during World War II. And that's after the borrowing of World War I, the borrowing of the Great Depression, and the borrowing of World War II. So the debt to GDP ratio actually is higher than GDP during World War II. And then it falls over time. It slides down so that by the 1970s, the ratio of debt to GDP is about 25%. We then see a series of big budget deficits in the 1980s, and the debt to GDP ratio starts rising again, and it peaks at about 50% of GDP in 1994. Then, with the slowdown in budget deficits in the mid-1990s and the surpluses, what you see is the debt to GDP ratio sliding. It drops down to 33% by 2001. Then with the big budget deficits of the last few years, it starts rising again. The big point, I guess, of that comparison is to say that the accumulated debt to GDP that the U.S. economy has in the mid-2000s is not extraordinarily high by historical standards. I mean, it's comparable to the debt to GDP ratio in the 1970s and in the early 1980s. We haven't yet gotten back to the peaks that we had in the 1980s, much less to the peaks that we had back around World War II. However, the long-run projections are dismal. The long-run projections for the federal budget show potentially extremely high debt to GDP ratios. What I want to do is look at some long-term projections about 75 years from now. And there's a funny thing about long-term projections. In some ways, long-term projections are less controversial than short-term projections, because over the long run, lots of stuff tends to even out, lots of different assumptions about the long run. And in some ways, most long-term projections look pretty similar, even if over the next 5 years the projections might look quite a bit different. I'm going to use projections from George Bush's Office of Management and Budget that were produced in 2005, but there are also projections from the Congressional Budget Office, projections from the Social Security and Medicare actuaries, projections from other sources, and they all tell basically the same story. The baseline projection for all of these things is that when you look at federal taxes, they creep up a little bit over time. As we discussed earlier, federal taxes have tended to be in the range of 17 to 19% of GDP over recent decades. The Bush administration's forecast in 2005 is that by 2075, out in the future, federal taxes will be 22% of GDP. So they actually predict a small increase, but not wildly outside of historical experience. But on the spending side is where the real problem hits. Discretionary spending, like defense and a lot of other programs, is currently about 7.9% of GDP. And the Bush folks project that this is going to drop to 5.9% of GDP by about 2015 and stay at that level afterwards. And I suspect there's a little wishful political thinking there about how much you can contract spending, but that's fine one way or the other. Where the rubber really hits the road is Social Security and Medicare spending. Social Security spending is 4.2% of GDP in 2005. By 2075, the prediction is it'll be 6.4% of GDP. So it'll be more than 2 percentage points of GDP higher. That's quite a lot if you remember that overall federal spending is 20% of GDP. But where the real problem lies with Medicare. Medicare is now 2.4% of GDP. It's about half the size of Social Security. According to the Bush projections, in 2075, Medicare will be 10.4% of GDP. Medicare will be larger than Social Security. Medicare alone will be the size of the defense budget back in the 1950s. Now again, these projections, the estimates change a little bit, but these projections roughly match those of the actuaries who look at the Social Security and Medicare systems. And if you put those two programs together, Social Security and Medicare, they're on track to increase government spending by 10% of GDP or more. And the really, really big hit here is not Social Security, it's healthcare spending. It's Medicare, and if you add Medicaid into the picture, that doesn't help things either. So healthcare expenses are going to be rising really dramatically in the current projections that are out there. And as the spending levels go up, the deficits get larger. As the deficits get larger, the interest payments on those deficits also get larger and larger. And by the time you look out a few decades into the future, you have just scary large numbers. For example, these estimates say that by about 2050, the U.S. economy will have a debt-to-GDP ratio of 100%, more or less the peak that we were at after fighting World War II. By 2070, we'd be at a situation where the debt-to-GDP ratio is 200%. Double the peak we were at in World War II. The old President Herbert Hoover is once reputed to have said, "Blessed are the young, for they shall inherit the national debt." But, you don't have to be all that young. If your life expectancy is, 30 years or more, the current projections for the national debt within your life expectancy are extremely large. And I repeat, this is not some controversial forecast. Long-term projections from the Congressional Budget Office and others are all sort of broadly similar. If spending on Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and other health programs goes up as projected, then we're either going to face some huge and historically unprecedented tax increases or some huge and historically unprecedented budget deficits, or both. I also want to emphasize that even if Social Security was fixed tomorrow with some set of tax increases and spending cuts, later retirement age, whatever you like, Medicare is really the problem here. Healthcare costs are really the problem here. And if you don't deal with that somehow, it eats up everything else. So, bottom line here, reducing federal borrowing or building up a budget surplus would increase the amount of capital available for private investment. It would also make the U.S. economy less dependent on foreign investment and reduce the trade deficit. So, how do we do it? How do we reduce the government budget deficits? Well, the honest truth here is that the outlook is not great. The most aggressive plans I've seen for Social Security and for Medicare are about holding down their rate of growth. And that's the most aggressive plans that are out there. They're not about actually reducing their spending below current levels. And, there is a political constituency out there for having the federal government do something besides defense and the elderly and health care. There are a lot of other government programs. There's infrastructure issues in education and research and development and helping the poor and housing. And so there's other programs out there that people at some point may want to spend money on. So if the goal is to reduce the budget deficit, I have a hard time seeing how that's going to happen by reductions in spending. At best, we may keep a lid on spending as it steadily rises. So what about the other side? What about increasing taxes? That's certainly a possibility, but the magnitude of the required increase is daunting. Federal taxes have been in the range of 17 to 19% of GDP. And remember, about half of that, call it 9% of GDP, is income tax, individual income tax. Is it really conceivable to think that over the next 30 or 40 years, federal taxes are going to go up to 30 or 35% of GDP? Is it plausible to think that we'll have a tax increase which is quite a bit larger than the entire amount currently collected by the individual income tax? Can federal taxes overall double? At least in the current political setting, one party favors no new taxes, and the other party at least some people favor rolling back some of Bush's tax cuts from his first term. But I don't see any political figures anywhere close to the mainstream who are advocating an increase in federal taxes of 25%, 50%, 100% increase, doubling federal taxes. That just doesn't seem to be out there. Well, what other options have we got? What about if we could increase private saving? If we could increase private saving, then even if the deficit stayed large, more private saving could provide financial capital for private investment and also make the U.S. economy less reliant on foreign investment. So maybe if we could increase private saving, that gives us a bit of an end run around this problem. Well, we've tried to do this in various ways over recent decades by giving tax breaks to encourage different kinds of private saving. And I'm thinking here of IRA accounts, 401k accounts, and those kinds of accounts. The general idea of these is that if you don't have to pay taxes until after you withdraw the money from such an account, it increases the rate of return you'd receive. And a higher rate of return would encourage more private saving. So could these accounts give us a way of trying to increase private saving? I'd say the basic record right now of these is not all that encouraging. Overall, the private savings rate has been dropping, even while these accounts were in place. What seems to happen is that people are choosing to do their saving in these tax-favored accounts, but they're shifting over to those accounts money that would have been saved anyway. They're also borrowing a lot of money at the same time. So the net impact of it all doesn't seem to be to increase saving overall. How about if we go a step beyond incentives? A more aggressive policy step to encourage private saving would be to legally require or strongly encourage higher saving. This idea has both politically conservative and politically liberal backers, although they use a different vocabulary. I think they're largely talking about the same thing. The conservative vocabulary is often in terms of private retirement accounts, and there's this discussion of replacing part or all of Social Security and Medicare with private accounts. But really, to me, the key fact in terms of private saving, if you listen carefully, is that many of those plans would either require or strongly encourage people to put in more money than they're putting in now. For example, one of the common plans is maybe you get to put 1.5 percentage points of your Social Security payroll taxes in a personal account if you also put in an extra 1.5 percentage points of your own income in the account, above and beyond what's already there. In effect, that comes very close to a government requirement that people save more, that they put more money aside. On the liberal side, these kinds of proposals are sometimes called liberal paternalism. The general idea is that everyone would be required to have an IRA or a 401k account. Everyone would automatically have, say, 5 or 10% of income deposited in that account. Now, if you wanted to, you could cancel that deposit. You'd have the freedom not to do so. But the assumption is that lots and lots of people just go with the default plan, whatever it is. And so lots of them would just let the money pile up. Similarly, you could have all tax refunds go straight to your savings account. Again, you could opt out if you wanted, but many people wouldn't opt out. Many people would just let it pile up. So this is sort of the concept of liberal paternalism. It's paternalist in the way it sets up this option to encourage private saving, but it's liberal in the sense that you could opt out of it if you wanted to. Again, it comes very, very close to just requiring people to save more. Unless we do an aggressive plan of requiring people to save more, the long-term projections here for national saving are frankly grim. It seems as if none of the options are likely. I don't see how spending is going to fall. I don't see how taxes are going to rise by a lot. I don't see how private saving is going to rise by a lot. I don't see how the resulting deficits are bearable. They seem unimaginably large. So what I'm confessing here is I have a failure of imagination about the possibilities here. I mean, I can't imagine we'll run the enormous deficits currently projected. It would eat up a huge share of the available investment capital, and I can't imagine the U.S. economy can run a perpetual string of enormous trade deficits that will fund our budget deficits from the outside. I can't imagine that Social Security and Medicare alone are going to head toward 20% of GDP. Are we really going to spend a fifth of our economy just on those two government programs? I can't imagine that their benefits will grow as much as projected, but I can't imagine holding them down a whole lot either. So I can't imagine the benefits being cut in half. I can't imagine that the U.S. government is going to raise taxes drastically, double the tax bill to pay for all of this. I can't imagine that other government spending is going to be cut really dramatically. I mean, is defense spending going to be cut in half? I just can't imagine it. I can't imagine that private saving is going to increase dramatically in a way that lets the U.S. economy finance all of this. A wise economist named Herb Stein used to like to say, if something can't go on, it won't. I can't imagine that current trends will go on. They won't. But out of all this stuff, I can't imagine some of it is going to happen. It's almost enough to make an economist humble.